In this video, I want to show how to update Power Query using VBScript or Powershell. I also want to deal with background updates, which means that you can update the query and still work inside the sheet. My query is simple. It waits 2 seconds, then it grabs the current time and spits that out as a text. And one of my queries has background updates enabled, which we can see by going under the Data tab and click on Properties, and then click this little button, and we can see Enable Background. In the standard code, I'm simply going to refresh everything, which is the same as clicking the Refresh All button. To start, we need to make an Excel object, which is then a new object, a COM object, which is an Excel application. And then to make things easier, we're going to make it visible, which needs the $sign in front. And then my file path is going to be hard-coded, because I'm assuming you want a button on your desktop or in a folder where you can double-click it to update. So I will copy that. And then I need a workbook object, because we've now made the Excel instance, which is what happens when you open Excel. But then we need to open the actual file as a workbook object. So we use the Excel object to open the workbooks, which is then my file path. And then I use the refresh all action on my workbook. And I don't think it matters whether I capitalize it, but I'm going to. And then for testing purposes, I'll make the script wait for 3 seconds in order for us to see what happens. And then in my experimentation, I need to do the closing and saving in one step instead of splitting it up. So I want to close and say true in order to do a save and close. And then lastly, I need to quit the Excel instance. Otherwise, if you open up the task manager, you'll see a lot of Excel objects open. And that's actually everything I need. So if I close this, and if I then run it, we should see Excel open, and it is visible. But for some reason it doesn't focus, which I assume you have to do on your own. And we can see it's done updating. And for some reason it failed to quit. And all I did was kill the terminal and then restart it, which we can then see. And once again, once it's done updating, we can see it runs background, because this query has background, and then everything closed. And we can see that the file was actually changed, because we can see it was modified right now. So that was part 1. And then we can recreate the same code using VBScript instead, because maybe it works in the one language but not in the other. Again, we need to make an Excel app or an Excel object and also a workbook object. And again, I'm going to copy paste my file path and hard code that. And we need to set the Excel app to be, I want to create an object, which is then the Excel application. And again, I also want to make that visible. And we don't need the $signs in VBScript. And then we need to set the Excel workbook to be, I want to use the Excel app to do the workbooks.open function on my file path. Then I'm going to do the refresh all function. And then I'm going to make it sleep. And actually we do need to make it sleep here, because the problem with background query updating is that the instant you start the refresh, the code is going to go to the next line and then continue. In my case, my query only takes 2 seconds to run, so making it sleep for 3 seconds is fine. And then we can try to run it outside of Visual Studio Code. And I have an exclamation point, which I shouldn't have. After some testing, I thought my problem was I had the backslash in my file path. And I know in Python you need to make the string a raw string in order to interpret the backslash as an actual backslash, the literal character, but that wasn't a problem. I wrote set in front of my string, and you use set in order to set an object, which you don't do for a string, because I thought VBScript liked everything being objects, but that's wrong. But if I try to run it, we can see that it opens, and we see these values update, and then it closed, and I think my sleep was too short. Try that again. Because we need to be able to see the actual values change. And once again, this is a problem with background update being on, like I say here, but everything works, so that's fine. And then we can start dealing with the background update. I want to remind you that if you have background update turned on, then you're going to need to add a sleep in order to stop the code from continuing. Because again, the moment the refresh starts, in terms of your code, it means it's ready to go to the next line, so you're going to have problems. That's why it's better to turn off the background update, which is what this code will do. And I say that this code only works in Power Automate, which we're going to see in a moment. Like before, I want to start out with creating an Excel app object and an Excel workbook object. And I'm going to copy in the file path again. And again, I want to set the Excel app to be equal to create an object, which is an Excel application, and making it visible. And likewise, I want to set my Excel workbook object to be equal to the Excel app, where I want to open the workbooks of my file path. And just for our testing purposes, I want to add a sleep for 3000 milliseconds. just so we can see that nothing has happened yet. Then in order to refresh a specific query, you have to reference it by name. So I go into the Excel workbook, connections, and here, because I'm Danish, I need to add a prefix of Powershell with a dash. And I assume if you're English, you'll write query. And if you're not Danish or English, you'll have to write your own name, which you can see when you open up the workbook. If we open up the developer tab, we can say, I want to go into this workbook and grab the connections. And I'm just going to grab the first one and get the name. And we can see this prefix and then table 1. So that's how you get the name. Because when you go into the queries pane, you won't be able to see that prefix, meaning it's something you have to know that you need to add. And then I should copy that so I don't make a spelling mistake. And then this is OLEDBC connection. And I want to set the background query to be false. And you might want to turn this back on. In this code, I'm going to assume that you want the background query to be on. And that's nice for people who work in the sheet because they can keep working while it updates. But I'm going to have a problem, which I think is because this Powershell word includes the Danish letter Ø, and I think that PowerShell isn't happy, but I know if I run it inside Power Automate, then it works. In any case, I'm now going to say I want to refresh that connection, which I'm going to copy, and I want to refresh, meaning I'm only refreshing that one query instead of everything. And then we don't have to add a sleep, because when you have background update turned off, then the code is going to wait until the refresh is done, and then we can copy this and turn it on again. And then I want to add a wait just in order for us to be able to see anything before it closes. And again, I needed to do this in one step when I did my testing, instead of saving it and then closing it. And I'm guessing that's the same problem with background update, in that once you start the save, it actually moves to the close, and you want to wait until it's done saving. Then I can quit my app and set the Excel app to be nothing, and set the workbook to be nothing. And then we can save that. And then if I were to try and run that, it actually works. So now I'm very confused. Yeah, this is where it is. It can't find the subscript, which we can see is on line 11, which is where I referenced it by name. So that's a bummer. But if I copy this code, and if I then open up the VBScript action and copy in the code, if we then try to run it, and then if I'm quick, we can see the queries pane. We can see that it's updating. We can also see that the timestamp changes. Yeah, so now it's done, and then we wait the 3 seconds, and everything is fine. This works, assuming you're not Danish. If my assumption is correct, and the reason it doesn't work is because it has the Danish character Ø. So if you're from another country, it should be fine. The alternative option is that instead of referencing the query by name, we can do it by position, like I showed in VBA before, where I can reference it by saying index 1. Meaning if we copy this and then instead of referencing it by name, actually I can copy the whole thing, copy that, and then say it should instead be index 1. Apparently it's index 1 based, which means 1 is the first. And if we then try to run this, it should then open, and then we can see it updates down here, and we should see the timestamp change. That's fine. Yeah, so this works and it's fine. And this code, I would use this code if you want background queries to be on, which is fine, I guess. I personally prefer it being off because it's easier for automation. The problem with this code is that you assume that you want to turn the background query updating on again afterwards, but you don't actually have to. We can make some changes to this where instead of simply turning it off and then turning it on again, we can instead save the state, whether it's turned on or off, and then return it to this original. And we can always turn it off, that's not a problem. So what we can do is, before we do any changings, we can make a new variable saying background state, and that is then, I want to go into the workbook, the connections 1, and check what this background query state is. And instead of setting it to anything, I'm simply asking what it is, and then we can set that. Instead of true, we can set it to be whatever it was before. And in this case, it's set to true. So if we then try to run this, and actually I should add that as a comment. Yeah, if we try to run this, you can see that it's now fine and dandy, and it's updated, and then it closes. And if we then open up the workbook, we can see under the data tab, under properties, we can see that it's turned on, and then we turn it off now, and save and close. And when we then run it, then we have to wait, and we can then see it's still turned off. So this would be my preferred solution. I usually turn off the background update but maybe you want it to be turned on. Yeah, I would normally turn it off, so I would prefer if you were to change my workbook, I'd prefer it if you set things back to the way they were before, instead of assuming that I want the background query to be turned on. But that's actually everything. Unfortunately, I have to refer to the query by index instead of name, but I don't think you can change the index positions, meaning as long as you're referring to one of the first queries, then this is fine. But I still don't like how volatile this is, because that can mess up. To iterate, if you're not Danish, please refer to your query by name. If you are Danish, you have to do this solution. So